For decades, one question haunted anyone who dared look closely at Johnny Carson's life. What did the king of late night keep locked away from the world? The man who made America laugh every single night for 30 years never once let anyone truly see him. Not his wives, not his children, not even the closest friends who sat beside him in his mansion overlooking the Pacific. But death has a way of opening doors that were sealed shut for a lifetime. And when the people tasked with sorting through Carson's estate finally turned their attention to one particular structure on the property, a rusted garage tucked behind the main house, what they found changed everything. Not just about Johnny Carson, but about the man underneath the performer. The cars alone would have made headlines. Rare machines parked in silence, some untouched for years, each one tied to a moment in his life that no audience ever witnessed. But it wasn't the chrome or the horsepower that stopped people in their tracks. It was what was hidden between the cars. Sealed envelopes, locked boxes, a folder shoved behind a tool rack with handwriting that could only belong to one person. Letters that were never meant to be read by anyone, ever. And once they started reading, they realized that Johnny Carson had been carrying something far heavier than anyone ever suspected. Something that the world he built on laughter was never designed to hold. Johnny Carson left this world on January 23, 2005. He was 79 years old. The cause was emphysema, a disease that had quietly eaten away at his lungs for years. By the end, he was frail. His body had shrunk from the broad-shouldered man the country remembered into something worn down and tired. But even then, those who visited him in his final weeks said the sharpness was still there. A dry observation here, a raised eyebrow there. The timing never fully left him. Even when everything else was fading, he died quietly, away from cameras, away from the public eye he had performed under for 3 full decades. And that is exactly how he would have wanted it. The news hit on a Tuesday morning and spread within hours. Every major television network paused its regular programming to run tributes. Clips from The Tonight Show played on loop, the laugh track ringing out like a ghost of something that could never be replaced. Colleagues spoke publicly about what Carson meant to them. Jay Leno called him the greatest entertainer who ever lived. David Letterman simply said there was no one better. But underneath all of that public mourning, something else was stirring. Because the people who knew Carson best understood something the rest of the world was only beginning to grasp. Johnny Carson did not let people in. Not really. Not ever. He was a man who could fill a room with warmth and laughter for 60 minutes straight, then walk off that stage and into a silence so complete that even his own staff sometimes wondered if they truly knew him at all. And now that he was gone, the question everyone had been too polite or too cautious to ask out loud finally surfaced. What had he been hiding? The answer, as it turned out, was not in the house itself. Not in the awards lined up on shelves or the photographs stacked in neat albums. The answer was in the garage. But before anyone could get to that garage, they had to first understand the world Carson had built around it. In 1984, Carson spent $9.5 million on a piece of land in Malibu that most people had never heard of. Point Dume. It sat on a bluff at the edge of the California coastline. And from the moment he stepped onto that property for the first time, he knew it was where he wanted to disappear. The estate stretched across 4 full acres. Below the main structure, the Pacific Ocean stretched out in every direction, endless and indifferent to the fame of the man staring down at it. There was a beach at the bottom of the bluff, Little Dume Beach, private and untouched. The gardens were immaculate, filled with plants that caught the light in ways that made the whole property feel less like something built, and more like something that had simply grown there over centuries. Koi ponds sat in quiet corners. An aviary housed exotic birds whose calls echoed softly through the grounds. It was not a home designed to impress visitors. It was designed to keep them out. The main house was the work of architect Ed Niles, a man known for using glass and wood to blur the line between a building and its surroundings. The structure stood at 7,100 square feet, spread across 3 levels, and almost every wall that could be glass was glass. Towering panels faced the ocean, and light poured through them at every hour of the day. Above the central living area, a glass ceiling arched 30 feet into the air, and beneath it grew an indoor arboretum. Real trees with real roots, their branches reaching upward as though the house had been built around them rather than the other way around. The upper level was Carson's private world, a master suite with sweeping views of the water and 2 separate offices where he could sit with his thoughts and no one would bother him. The main level was designed for living. A kitchen that could handle any gathering, a wine cellar that reflected his taste, and a media room where Carson could watch other people perform for once, without being the one in front of the camera. Outside there was a saltwater pool, a spa, a tennis court, and a pavilion that some said was a gift from NBC itself. The parking area was wide enough to hold dozens of vehicles, and at the edge of that parking area, set back slightly from the main structure, sat the garage. Carson was not someone who invited people to see his home. The glass walls might have suggested openness, but in reality they were just another layer of the performance. When the estate executives arrived after his death to begin cataloging everything Carson owned, they moved through the property methodically, room by room, cabinet by cabinet. They found awards, photographs, memorabilia from 30 years of television. They found boxes labeled miscellaneous that no one had ever opened. They found cabinets with no keys. They found storage areas that had been sealed so long that the dust on the handles told its own story. One assistant, during an early walkthrough, hesitated before turning a handle on a door in the back hallway. Something about it felt different, heavier, but they moved on. Because the real weight of the property, the real center of gravity that everyone kept circling back to without quite understanding why, was the garage. The garage door opened with a mechanical groan, its metal panels folding upward until a cone of light cut through the darkness inside. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that only comes when a space has been sealed for a very long time. And then the light reached the floor, and what it illuminated stopped everyone in the room. Cars. Not just cars sitting in a garage, but machines arranged with a care that bordered on reverence. Each one clean, each one deliberate, each one a chapter in a story that Johnny Carson had never told anyone out loud. The first thing that drew attention was the 1939 Chrysler Royal parked at the far end of the space. It was old, faded in places where the paint had surrendered to decades of sun and neglect. But it was unmistakably cared for and unmistakably important. This was the car that had belonged to Carson's father, the very vehicle in which a young Johnny had first learned to put his hands on a steering wheel and feel what it meant to move forward on his own. The Chrysler was not about speed or style, it was about where he came from, and when Carson died, he left it to Jay Leno in his will, not as a collector's item, as something that carried meaning. Next to the Chrysler, catching the light on its brushed steel panels, sat a 1981 DeLorean DMC-12. The gull-wing doors were closed, folded down against the body of the car like the wings of something that had landed and never taken off again. Carson had not simply admired the DeLorean, he had believed in it. He was one of the company's early investors, putting $500,000 of his own money into the dream. The car itself had a history with Carson that went beyond investment. At one point, he was driving the DeLorean when its electrical system failed completely. The gull-wing doors locked shut. Carson was trapped inside, pounding on the glass until someone finally reached him. It became one of his favorite stories to tell. A moment of genuine helplessness turned into comedy the way only Carson could manage. But sitting there in the garage years after that incident, the DeLorean felt like something else entirely. A car with doors that would not open, a man with secrets that would not let go. The 1988 Mercedes-Benz 560C sat beside it in pristine white, its leather interior still holding the shape of someone who had spent real time inside it. This was not a show car. It was refined, understated, the kind of vehicle that told you everything about the person who chose it without ever raising its voice. Carson kept this car for over a decade, long after other machines in the collection had come and gone. A former valet who worked at the property once mentioned that he had seen documents inside the glove compartment, papers that Carson kept close, things that never left the house. No one followed up on that detail at the time, but standing in the garage after Carson's death With sealed envelopes already surfacing in other corners of the property, the comment took on a weight it had not carried before. Then there was the 1992 Chevrolet Corvette, parked near the center of the collection. This was Carson's last car, the final vehicle he ever drove with any regularity. Some of the estate workers looked at it and saw closure, the last chapter of a man who had always loved the road and the freedom it represented. Others wondered what he might have left inside it. A journal, maybe. Letters he started but never finished. And tucked near the back wall, almost hidden behind the larger vehicles, sat a 1966 Gear 450 SS. Italian curves, aggressive lines. The kind of car that whispered about a side of Carson most people never saw, the part of him that enjoyed the rare, the unusual, the beautiful things that existed outside the spotlight. But the cars were only the surface. As the executives worked deeper into the garage, they began to notice things that did not belong in any collection of automobiles. Boxes stacked against the back wall, labeled only with the word miscellaneous. Cabinets bolted shut with no keys anywhere in sight. A folder wedged into a narrow gap behind a tool rack, as though someone had slid it there in a hurry and then walked away. One assistant pulled the folder free carefully, as though it might fall apart. It did not. Inside was a single envelope, sealed, yellowed with age in the way that paper yellows when it has been sitting in one place for years without anyone touching it, and on the front, written in a hand that several people in the room immediately recognized as Carson's own, was a name that no one present had ever heard before. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from shock, but the kind that comes from understanding. Johnny Carson had spent his entire career giving the world a version of himself that was polished and controlled and endlessly entertaining. But here, in a garage behind a mansion on a cliff overlooking the ocean, was proof that another version existed. A version that had been writing letters in private, sealing them, hiding them, and when they began to unfold the paper inside carefully, the way you handle something fragile and final, they understood that what they were reading might change the shape of everything the world thought it knew about the man who had made it laugh for 30 years. Johnny Carson married 4 times. Each marriage told a different part of the same story, and none of them ended the way either person had hoped. The first was to Joan Jody Morrill Walcott in 1949. Carson was not yet famous. They had 3 sons together, Chris, Rick, and Corey. The early years carried quiet promise, but Carson's career began to accelerate, and with it came the absences. Long stretches away from home, the drinking, which grew louder as the pressure of fame settled onto his shoulders. By 1963, after 14 years of a marriage that had been cracking under the weight of all of those things, it ended in divorce. Only months later, he married Joanne Copeland. She entered his life at the peak of his fame. For nearly a decade, she lived inside the strange duality that defined Carson's private world. Joanne spoke about it years later with a frankness that surprised people. She said that alcohol turned him into 2 entirely different people. The man she loved would disappear, replaced by someone tense and sharp and unpredictable. By 1972, the marriage had collapsed under the weight of those shifts. That same year, Carson married Joanna Holland. This marriage lasted 13 years, longer than either of the 2 before it, but it carried the same patterns, the same slow erosion of trust. And when it ended in 1985, it did so with a cruelty that even Carson did not expect. Holland announced the divorce publicly on the very night of their wedding anniversary. Carson had no idea it was coming. It was one of the rare moments in his life when the man who spent every night in control of a room found himself completely blindsided. His 4th and final marriage was to Alexis Mars in 1987. This one held. It lasted until his death 18 years later. Friends described Alexis as steady and calm in a way that complemented Carson's restless nature. She did not try to change him. She simply existed beside him, offering a quietness that he had spent decades searching for without ever admitting it. The heaviest part of Carson's private story was not his marriages, it was his sons. Chris, Rick, and Corey grew up in the shadow of a man who was everywhere on television and almost nowhere at home. Carson admitted, in rare moments of honesty, that he had not been the father he wanted to be. Rick, the middle son, suffered the most. He struggled with mental illness for years, cycling through treatment and hospitalization. Carson did not always show up during those difficult times. There were reports that he did not visit Rick during at least one hospital stay. It was not cruelty. It was distance. The same distance Carson maintained from everything that threatened to pull him out from behind the carefully constructed image he had spent his life building. And then, in 1991, Rick died. A car accident. He was 39 years old. Carson spoke about his son's death on air, and for once the composure cracked just enough for the audience to see what was underneath. But those who knew him said the grief ran far deeper than any television moment could capture. It was sharpened by guilt, by the years of absence, by all the visits that never happened. It was this guilt that made what the garage revealed so devastating. Among the cars and the locked cabinets and the sealed boxes, the executives found letters, raw, handwritten notes. Some were addressed simply to my boys, written in a hand that was neat but careful, as though Carson had been rehearsing each sentence before committing it to paper. One envelope, fragile enough that the handlers held it with both hands, appeared to be addressed to Rick. Inside, the words were unlike anything Carson had ever spoken publicly. There was regret in them, plain and unguarded, a wish to have been present during the years when presence mattered most, a hope, quiet and almost tentative, that his son had known he was loved, even during the long silences when love was the last thing that seemed to be showing itself. The contrast between those words and the man the world remembered was striking. This was not the entertainer. This was a father who had failed in the one role that mattered most, and who had spent years trying to say so in letters he never sent to anyone. Carson's relationship with alcohol shaped nearly every relationship he had. Biographers who spent years researching his life wrote extensively about the way drinking transformed him. It was not occasional, it was consistent, and it followed a pattern that his wives all described in similar terms. The charm would be there first, filling a room the way it always did. Then a drink would arrive, and somewhere in that progression the man behind the charm would begin to surface, someone harder, someone whose words could cut in ways that left marks long after the evening was over. The first marriage to Jody Walcott carried the same signature, arguments that erupted in front of others, loud and ugly, followed by days of silence in which neither person acknowledged what had been said. The cycle repeated itself enough times that it became the structure of the relationship itself. The drinking surfaced publicly in 1982 when Carson was arrested for driving under the influence near Beverly Hills. The story made headlines immediately. He pled no contest. He was fined. He was placed on probation. It was handled quietly, the way Carson handled everything, but it was the first time the private consequences of his drinking had become a matter of public record. Behind closed doors, the consequences had been present for much longer. Carson's marriage to Joanne Copeland carried an additional layer of pain. There were persistent rumors that she had been unfaithful, specifically with football star Frank Gifford. For a man who already struggled to trust the people closest to him, the betrayal confirmed something he had long suspected about the nature of intimacy itself, that it was unreliable, that the people who promised to stay were the ones most likely to deceive. That suspicion fed into his rivalries as well. The feud with Wayne Newton began over a business dispute involving the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. Carson used his platform to mock Newton publicly, and Newton later said the jokes were designed to wound. With Joan Rivers, the rupture was different but no less complete. Rivers had been one of Carson's most loyal guest hosts. When she left to start her own competing talk show, Carson interpreted it as a personal betrayal. He cut her off entirely. The silence lasted until his death. It was the most complete expression of how Carson dealt with people who disappointed him. He did not confront. He did not forgive. He simply closed the door and never opened it again. Johnny Carson did not begin his life in the spotlight. He was born in Corning, Iowa, in 1925, during a time when the country was still reeling from economic collapse. He was a quiet child, shy in the way that children are shy when the world feels too large. But he found something early on that gave him a sense of control. Magic. He began performing tricks for neighbors, and even as a boy there was something about the way he held a room that suggested he understood instinctively what it meant to make people watch you. He served in the Navy during World War II, and when he returned, he moved toward radio. His voice carried a calm authority that fit the medium perfectly. By the 1950s, television was expanding rapidly, and Carson recognized before most people did that it was the future of entertainment. He hosted Who Do You Trust? And in 1962, he took over The Tonight Show. He was 36 years old, and for the next 30 years he would redefine what late-night television could be. The Tonight Show under Carson was not simply a talk show. It was a nightly institution that tens of millions of Americans observed before closing their eyes. His monologues were sharp and topical, funny without being cruel. His interviews felt effortless, though anyone who watched him work closely understood that the ease was the result of extraordinary preparation. He could make a nervous guest laugh. He could fill dead air with a single raised eyebrow. When Carson retired in 1992, the farewell broadcast drew an audience of over 50 million viewers. The awards followed naturally. 6 Emmy Awards, a Peabody, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1993, and the Kennedy Center honors. His legacy was not measured primarily in awards, though. It was measured in the people who came after him. Jay Leno, David Letterman, Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Fallon, all of them studied Carson, not as a historical figure, but as a living model of how to do the job. But the garage added something to that legacy that no tribute broadcasts could have captured. Among the cars and the sealed boxes, the estate handlers found writing. Pages where Carson had been thinking on paper, turning over questions about fame and loneliness and the cost of the life he had chosen. In one folder, they found reflections that read less like the thoughts of a television legend and more like the private wrestlings of a man who understood exactly what his choices had taken from him. These were not the words of someone performing. They were the words of someone trying to make sense of a life that had given him everything the world measures success by, and left him with far less than he had hoped for in the quieter moments. For the biographers and historians who would eventually spend years sorting through what was found in that garage, the discoveries did not simplify Carson's story. They complicated it in ways that made him feel less like a monument and more like a person. Was Johnny Carson the perfectly controlled entertainer who kept every feeling locked behind a door no one could open? Or was he a man who spent decades writing those feelings down in private, sealing them in envelopes, and hiding them in places where they might someday be found? The answer, like so much about Carson, is probably both. The laughter was real, the silence was real, and somewhere between the two, in a garage on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the truest version of Johnny Carson waited for the world to catch up to who he actually was.